Most people think that the ego is something that only a certain group of people have. That these are the people who are boastful, arrogant, people who think that they are the best, and they have a need of telling everybody about it. But in fact, the ego is something that's much more sneaky. And today I would like to cover 3 characteristics of the ego that I think are the most important. And the lack of understanding of this is actually what's holding us back from taking action. Because very often we are mistaking ourselves with the ego. And the ego is actually a very funny thing. It's both real and not real at the same time. So let's talk about the ego. Ego has 3 characteristics. And number 1 is that ego is basically a psychological identity. In other words, the ego is like a mental construct that we have of what we think we are or who we think we are. So everything that comes after I am, which means I am the best, I am a bad person, I'm great at recording videos, I am comfortable in front of a camera, and so on. So these are basically the labels that we put on ourselves, and this is what creates this mental construct that is actually used by the ego to define itself, okay? So this is the psychological identity, and in other words, you can also call it self-image. If you have maybe read a book called Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, he is explaining something about the self-image, and in fact, this is actually the same. So the ego and the self-image you can think of as the same thing. And the ego actually cannot live without defining itself. So it always has to be, I am this, or I am that, or I'm not this, or I'm not that, because it works in the material world. It actually operates, it's attached to material world. Okay? It's attached to anything that's external. So maybe your successes or lack of successes, maybe the car that you're driving or the car that you don't have. It might be also defining itself through the relationship that you're in or the relationship that you are not in. Because the ego always needs to define itself. So this is the key characteristic. And the most important thing is that it's not you. It's not you. The fact that I can talk about it now, and you can look at the ego objectively, and that you put the labels on yourself, and this is what starts forming this mental construct, is actually the proof that you are not the ego. Because if you would be the ego, you would not be able to talk about it. For example, my cat now is jumping around, and it doesn't know that it is a cat. It doesn't know that it has whatever mental construct. So we as humans can do it because we have the self-awareness, and we are more than the labels that we use for ourselves, that we put on ourselves. And the second characteristic is that it focuses on survival. Survival. I would add at all costs. Okay? So this is survival at all costs. And because for ego, every change that we want to make for this mental construct that's created in our mind, every change that we want to make, it actually equals death. Change equals death. But is it the death of us? No. It is the death of ego. It's the death of the psychological construct of who we think we are. And the problem is that when we are about to make a change, we actually mistake like a pure biological reaction that we have when we do something new. Let's say you want to make phone calls to your prospects, you want to sell your services or products, or you want to start working out. Maybe you have some social anxiety and when you want to get out to people and talk to strangers. Then for the ego, because of the way it attaches itself to a certain identity, it might be an identity of I am shy, or I really cannot make phone calls, or I am really bad at making phone calls. What will people think of me, and so on. So when you have these thoughts, what the ego is actually creating is the fear of change. And this fear of change that the ego creates is actually an illusion. Because the ego is afraid of death of itself. Because what kind of danger you really have in talking to strangers? Or what is the danger of recording this video? Like, there's no real danger. Nothing is going to jump on me from the trees. So this is actually made up. This is imaginary. But when you have, let's say, a real life situation where your life is really at risk, for example, you want to step out of the cliff and you are very close to the cliff and your body is telling you, hey, you might fall, be careful. This is actually this is the good thing. This is actually a good fear, because this is a real biological response to actually a real threat of your life. But most of the things that we do on a daily basis, there's no real threat. But it creates the same biological response. Your cortisol level goes up, your adrenaline level goes up, and you think that something is wrong with you. But what actually is happening is that ego is afraid of death. So, because if you do it, then the ego will have to admit that it was not whatever it was thinking it is. And the ego is always attached to whatever identity that it has. It can be a positive identity or a negative one. It doesn't really matter. You know, when you have a person that I mentioned that is arrogant, person who thinks that I'm the best and I can do everything I want and so on, you can think of this person as egotistical. But if someone comes to you and says, you know, life is really hard for me and nobody loves me and everything that I do just falls apart and so on, you would not think of this person as egotistical, would you? You would not put that label on that person. Why is this? It's because of the programming that we have about what we think the ego is. And the fact is that the ego is something that we all have. And it doesn't matter what label is used to define yourself, then for ego it's fine. As long as it can attach itself to something from, you can say, material world, either achievements or lack of achievements, us being good or bad, whatever it is, ego is happy. It will take whatever. As long as it can maintain that identity and it can actually pretend to be you, then ego is fine with it. Okay? So when it comes to the third one, ego always lives in the duality. It always lives in the duality, and the duality is implied everywhere. So when you think of the ego being actually a survival mechanism in our psyche, then it's always me versus you. Or it is always me versus the world, right? It's always me versus world. So there is no unity. Ego doesn't understand the concept of us being a humanity, for example, and that we share the same consciousness, that we come from the same source. Ego doesn't understand it. It just focuses on me and versus the others. It always needs some kind of conflicts to survive. It always needs conflicts to feel that it exists. That's why we have this weird pleasure from arguing with people. So if I have an opinion A and you have an opinion B, then why is this that I have this weird urge to correct you and say that my opinion is better than yours? It's just a viewpoint, but it's because of the attachment of the ego to whatever opinion. As long as it can keep any opinion and fight for it, it's happy because it perpetuates the state of me versus the world. Okay? It's always me versus the world. And if you operate from that consciousness where there's always you and other people who are worse or better, or that you are separate, it will create always this very weird sense of separation. Ego always wants to be separate from others, separate from other people, from the world, from all the creatures around us. It's basically you put yourself even in a room full of people and you can really feel alone because of this. Because you operate from the survival consciousness, and the ego always lives on the survival plane. I will add something here from David Hawkins, which is like a map of consciousness. I'll put it somewhere on the screen, where you see that anything that's below courage is actually the domain of the animalistic world. So this is where we were as humans for a long time. And now it's changing. We are actually above courage, and we start getting into the love and the enlightenment and other states. But what's important to understand that the ego is actually not us, okay? Ego is not us. And the ego is not the enemy. If you think about the ego as an enemy, because that's also very popular, I used to do it. Ego is something that you have to fight, and the ego is something that you need to get rid of, then this is actually not a good idea. If you think in terms of fighting and the force, then you are actually getting in that consciousness of survival. You get to those lower level of consciousness, and you really cannot create from this low level of consciousness. You just can't. Because you can't create from the survival state, because this is the domain of the animals, the animalistic world. So what you need to remember is this, that you are not the ego. Ego is a tool that you use on a daily basis, because we can't really get out of using the words I am this, I am that, and defining ourselves. Of course, it's better to define yourself as someone who is powerful, someone who has unlimited potential, someone who can actually do things in this world and not to be a victim. This is what you would call like a helpful psychological identity. You can say helpful self-image, creative self-image. But do not mistake yourself with the ego. Because you can say it's like a coat or like a mask that you put on to operate in this world. Because it's easier simply if you have healthy and positive self-image than if you have a negative one, like a victimized self-image, okay? All right, so now let's talk about the most important part. So if you are not the thoughts, the labels, the fears, all the emotions that you feel, then who are you really? So let's explore the real you. The real you. And the real you, I also group or put like 3 characteristics of the real you, is actually to describe the real you, but the real you cannot be described. So this is a paradox of it. Because you are the pure beingness. Beingness. Or you can say an observer, or some people say consciousness. You can also say consciousness. What does it mean? It means that if you don't use any labels, if you can't describe yourself, because we said that the ego has to describe itself, but if you are an observer who can observe the ego, you are a consciousness that is kind of above the ego and can actually talk about it and can say, this is not me, then this means that you cannot be defined. You cannot be defined. Can't be defined. And because there is no label, you can say that the real you is unlimited. There's no box around it. So for the ego, there is always some kind of box because of the label that it's using on itself. So we say, for example, I am a father, or I am the best, or I'm a bad person, or I have a big nose, I am stupid, I have the greatest business on the planet, or I'm a psychologist. All these kind of labels that we use. Because we put labels, this is limiting us. Because if you say, I am X, then at the same time, ego implies there is, because of the duality, that you can't be something else, right? So if you are pure consciousness and the pure beingness, you cannot be defined. And the way to kind of strip away all these labels and to kind of sense who you are, because this is something that you need to sense in your body, is not really something that can be described. And the way to really sense this beingness or this presence that you are, that cannot be defined, is if you ask yourself, who am I if I didn't have any history, if I didn't have any thoughts about myself, if I didn't have any future? What's left, basically? What's left? And when you ask yourself this, you basically kind of feel and sense like a pure silence and a lot of peace. And this is actually who you are in your core. It's undescribable. It's like a pure joy that is not dependent on anything. Okay? So you are not your achievements, you are not your bank account, you are not your relationships, you are not the name that you have. These are a bunch of words that somebody told you that you are a long time ago. But this is not the real you. This is a bunch of letters that someone put together and they say, this is you from now on, right? But we know that you are not that anymore because you're non-conceptual. So any concept that you use is not going to fit because it's not really you. And the second characteristic of the real you is that it's focused on creation. There is no survival anymore. This part of you is focused on expansion, on curiosity. When you do something new, when you want to build a business, make the phone calls, start maybe meeting strangers, then for this part of you, this is the expansion. There's a curiosity behind it about what's gonna come. And for the ego, it's always threat. It's always the change equals death, right? But for the real you, it's expansion. This is basically the nature of us as human beings. We actually live on the three planes, you can say, which is the spiritual, intellectual, and physical. And you can say that the real you is on the spiritual plane here. You operate on the spiritual plane, and the ego is here. And somewhere in between is the intellect that's either used by the spiritual side of you or the ego. Unfortunately, for most of us, the ego is using our intellect to serve itself and not to really serve the higher side of us, okay? So when you operate from this side of you, then there is curiosity. There is no psychological fear anymore about doing something new. I'm not saying that you will feel comfortable doing it, but you will not suffer because of the ego's psychological responses and the tricks that it's using on you. Because you know when you feel uncomfortable, for the real you, you are curious about the outcome and the expansion, and you know it's going to feel good, but for the ego, it's always a threat, right? And the third characteristic is non-duality. We said that the ego operates in the duality, right? Non-duality, or you can say oneness. Oneness. So this side of you doesn't know the concept of me versus the world, because there is no survival in it. It is focused on the collaboration. It focuses on that we are basically part of one, you can say, source, where we emanate from. If you look at it from the, let's say, sun perspective, so you have a sun and the sun rays are coming from the sun. So the sun rays, even though they are very far from the sun, you can say, but there's this invisible link between the sun and the sun rays, right? And the sun ray is not suddenly saying, no, I'm alone in this world, and I am very far away from the sun, and I am so lonely, and all this kind of stuff. This is only us who are doing it, right? As humans. We feel this kind of separateness from the totality of things and from other people, but it's because of the ego. But the real us is basically everywhere at the same time, and we are connected to the source all the time. So there's no fighting for survival anymore. When you operate from that consciousness, you realize that everything that you need is coming from the same source. We are part of the same source. All the animals, all the objects, the material world, and also all the ideas that we have to improve our life, it's coming from the same source. Even the ego comes from the same source. It's really funny. And the ego is necessary for us to survive in this world, in the physical world. For some reason, it is part of our evolution as humans. But we need to understand that we are not the ego. We are the higher consciousness. And because you know that you are the extension of this higher consciousness, then you are basically in the state of peace. Peace, love, you can say it's peace, love. Peace, love, and collaboration. So when you operate from that, life becomes lighter because you're not fighting against the current. You're collaborating with people. When you are doing something, you do it to add the value, and you don't really care about what you're going to get back, because ego always has some kind of expectation that, oh, if I do this, then I'm going to get back from this person this. And if the ego doesn't get it, then it gets really angry. And then you mistake yourself with this anger response from the ego, right? So when you operate from the creation and you know who you really are, then you are basically feeling most of the time the peace, love, and you want to collaborate with the world, and the life is just easier. So what is that, you can say, link between where am I operating with from the ego and where I am operating from the higher self, or the beingness, the consciousness, whatever you want to call it. So that line or that connection is the awareness of it in the particular moment. So you need to be aware. This is the key. You need to be aware. Aware of what? Aware of, am I operating from the ego or am I operating from the higher consciousness? Am I present or am I lost in the continuous streams of thought that the ego creates about who I am, about how people should be, about what he did or he didn't do, or what she did and shouldn't do? If you get lost in the stream of thoughts, this is the domain of ego. If you are a pure being and you are centered in yourself, you are basically quiet, you have a quiet mind, you are present in the present moment, then this is where you actually enter this side of you, which is the real you, and it's always with you. It's just a matter of being aware of, am I actually now operating from the higher self or the lower self? The lower self is the ego, and the higher self is the pure consciousness and the presence. And if you have that, then life just becomes a nice journey, and it's then easier to do what you need to do because you don't fight anymore the reality. For example, in the next video, I'm going to share like the 4-step process of how to actually make a change and what's really holding us back. Part of it is actually that we are not aware who we are, because we are identifying with the ego and not really understanding who we are at our core. When the things get haywire, when we are about to make that move, to record that video, post it on YouTube, and just show ourselves to the world, then when this happens, things go haywire. And at this moment, if you really don't have a deep understanding and a deep connection to that real side of you, who you really are, then the ego response and the biological response that we have is so strong that it's very easy then to fall back to the lower levels of consciousness, where you again go to the survival, and you just postpone whatever you need to do for tomorrow and so on. I hope it helps. And before I go, I would like to ask you one question. So where do you see yourself struggling the most with when it comes to the awareness of, am I operating from the ego or from the real me, which is the higher consciousness and the higher self? Put it in the comments. I'm really curious what you think. See you in the next one.